have qualified immunity.
Insurance definitely needs to be a part of the solution to either reform or end qualified immunity, and here's why. Insurance companies' sole motive in existing is to make money. And I like to use this example when talking about insurance companies. So they actually invest time, resources, and effort into researching on how to, whatever they're insuring, make it safer and better so that they don't have to pay out insurance settlements. For example, after Hurricane Ivan and Katrina came through, the homeowners insurance companies got together in the state of Alabama. We developed what's called a fortified home roof program. You got gold, silver, and bronze fortified roofs where with different levels of protection. And the insurance company is like, great, if you rebuild your houses or rebuild your roofs to these standards, we'll offer you discounts on insurance premiums because it's going to be better for us. We're not going to have to pay out payouts. The Hurricane Sally was the last hurricane to hit our area, and you could one of the state senators from that represents the Gulf Shores, Orange Beach area, he said you could literally fly in a helicopter and you could see which homes had certified or fortified roofs and which ones didn't, because and that's a market-based solution that insurance companies came up with and incentivized to do people to not only make their homes safer for themselves, but also a less of an insurance risk for the insurance company. Yep. They do the same thing with automobiles. Well, a lot of these safety features that we have in automobiles nowadays with automatic braking, blindside alerts and all this other stuff, airbags and seatbelts, came from pressure from the insurance companies. So the insurance companies can and will do the same thing with police malpractice insurance, which is what that would be. And they can go to police departments. They can say, if this is your training program and this is how you train your officers, and then we can offer you discounts on your insurance rates. And cities, smart cities, would be like, great, let's save some money and let's do this.
You know, one funny thing is, I think similar to other kinds of insurance, this would actually probably have to be run like you're saying, by private companies rather than by the state. Like the National Flood Insurance program has its problems because it's run by the state and it doesn't account for risk quite the same way and stuff. It's just funny you had me thinking about that. I'm sure you all are very excited about hearing about insurance, but actually when you get into it, there's some really cool stuff it can do. I wanted to highlight that though, just as unfortunately an insurance nerd where I've ended up in life. One question I wanted to get to that I think that it stumps a lot of people, and it kind of stops a lot of people from engaging in this debate. And I'd really be curious to hear from you all your best reason why either modifying or getting rid of qualified immunity wouldn't stop police officers from doing scary things, like from being able to stop murders, from having to kill when they have to kill sometimes. Like how wouldn't this, I know you're not supposed to ask questions like that, but how wouldn't this cause problems that way?
Yeah, so that's already covered. It's called scope of duty. So I've had a lot of police officers and firefighters and paramedics and people like that who've come to me at my events or reached out to me online and said, I'm being told that if qualified immunity ends, if I'm, pulling someone out of a burning building and they get glass in their arm and it gets infected and the arm has to be amputated, I'm going to get sued for that. Or if I'm, pull someone over and they start fighting me and I fight back and they fall and, break their jaw, I'm going to get sued for that. Or, all these other examples. And I say no, and I give them examples of court cases where that's covered under scope of duty. Qualified immunity is when it has already been established that the government employee or agent in question already broke the law and violated someone's rights. So they got to do scary things, but at no point does their doing a scary thing give them the right to violate your rights, right? We don't have the right to violate people's rights, so we can't give that right, bestow that right upon someone else. So clearly they can't do that. But if they have to do something scary and it causes someone else to get harmed and it's established that they had to do it, well, then they never even have to invoke qualified immunity, and that's already the case. And here's how insane the entire idea of clearly established is. When they say clearly established, they take that to mean that the exact same thing you did had to already have been established prior to when you did it in court, that to have been illegal and to have violated the Constitution, violated someone's rights, in that federal judicial district. Not in America, in just that district. And here's how insane, I'll give you 3 examples of just how insane that is. There was a case where officers had someone arrested. He was sitting on the curb, he was already handcuffed, and they decided to have one of their canines maul him a little bit, just for fun. And they got qualified immunity, even though that exact type of thing had already happened in that district, because in the other case, the guy was lying down, he wasn't sitting on the curb. They were both handcuffed, but one was lying down, one was sitting up. There was another case where 2 prison workers were tasing a man that was in custody, that was in a cell, no harm to anyone. I think they were just doing it to amuse themselves, but for whatever reason, they got qualified immunity, even though something similar had happened in that district, because in the other case, they had used tear gas and not a taser. Then there was a case where officers stole, I think, $200,000 or $300,000 worth of coins, and they got qualified immunity for stealing, even though other officers had also been caught stealing in that district, because in the other case it was cash and not, coins, and so it wasn't legal tender. That's what clearly established looked like. That's what qualified immunity looks like.
Well, as a big fan of Tom Sowell, who reminds us that in so many cases in human affairs, we don't have solutions, we have trade-offs.
Yeah.
And there's no way that you're going to have any sort of rule, law, regulation that's going to keep bad people from doing bad things.
Of course.
And I think we have to realize what the trade-offs are. And qualified immunity is currently interpreted. I think it's certainly the very bad trade-off, and I think that we can improve. One point, if I may, and I've got to do this. I think if we were to adopt a much more libertarian perspective on what should be illegal or criminal, if we got rid of so many laws that criminalize private behavior, so many of these situations just wouldn't occur.
Yes, correct.
So again, an overarching point is, if we don't have so many things that are criminal because they don't actually involve rights violated behavior, many of these problems are going to go away, or at least to be of a much lower level of difficulty.
100%.
Medical malpractice laws and liability doesn't stop surgeons from performing surgery. It stops them from performing surgeries drunk, well, most of them, or high on drugs, or most of them, because every time a surgeon cuts into somebody for a surgery, even be a minor surgery or a major surgery to remove cancer, they run the risk of their patient dying on the table. If they do everything right, follow their training, and they might get sued because their patient died, but their insurance company is going to defend them because they did everything right, and if they followed their training. If they don't follow their training and they do stuff wrong, like perform surgery drunk or high, and their insurance companies may cut the people that sue them a check. But then, the next thing that insurance company is going to do, drop them like a bag of rocks, because it's too much of a liability for them. They become uninsurable, as Spike spoke of earlier. So just doing away with qualified immunity or making it tougher to get qualified immunity isn't going to stop cops from being able to do their jobs effectively. It's just going to hold them more accountable under the law when they do something wrong.
Yeah.
The last question I have, because we only have about a minute left, but I'd be curious if any of you believe that they should have a level of immunity, but just a modified, or if you're all like, basically everything without qualified immunity is enough and that works and you don't need anything additional.
If it's in their scope of duty and they had to do it and they didn't violate anyone's rights, then I think that should cover it. And I don't think there needs to be anything additional, because their jobs can be scary. Loggers' jobs can be scary. I think the people most likely to die while working are like pizza delivery drivers. Like, their jobs are scary. All of us could potentially have a scary job if we're interacting with the public. Who here has ever worked in retail? Okay, yeah. So that can get scary, but you don't get to like beat the person up because they didn't comply when you told them to put the shirt back or whatever, or to whatever. But they shouldn't have special protections just because their job is scary. There are a lot of scary jobs.
I mean, under common law, there are protections against situations where people, as you say, scope of duty. There are common law protections, and I don't think that again the entire panoply of things associated with qualified immunity, we don't need them.
No.
And I agree with those two guys that we don't need qualified immunity because we already have immunity in place for officers and public officials that do their jobs and do their jobs as well, and they're to very well, and do it with a kind heart and a servant's heart, and just having qualified immunity just basically allows the bad apples, as Spike likes to say, go in there and ruin the reputation of a police department.
Definitely. Thank you. I think we're out of time, or at least that's what the clock says. I'm ruled by the clock. I don't have any special instructions beyond the clock. So I'd like to give everyone a round of applause for knowing so much more than I do on the subject.
I'm gonna let y'all go.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next discussion. Countless individuals throughout the country are suffering from ideological and cultural divisions that run so deep that people are beginning to recommend a national divorce as a way to solve this problem. Proponents of this idea argue that by peacefully separating, we are better able to individually act on our own. Each state can run their government the best way possible. While opponents argue that federalism and civil disobedience is a much better way of allowing people to flourish. The moderator for this discussion will be Reason editor Jason Russell. The proponent of the idea of national divorce will be Mises Institute editor Ryan McCracken, and the opponent will be the chair of the Libertarian Classical Liberal Caucus, Jonathan Casey. Thank you.
Morning, LibertyCon! Thank you, thank you. If you are a big fan of debates, give us some enthusiastic applause. Yeah? Good, good. That's what I like to hear. Then let's get ready to rumble intellectually. No fisticuffs, please. No fisticuffs. Thank you for that kind introduction. I am Jason Russell. I'm the managing editor of Reason magazine. And Reason loves debate. Last year around this time, we did a whole issue about debates. We had more than 10 really interesting debates that are within the libertarian movement and very hard questions. Some of those debates are about Ukraine, Brexit. One of them was about the very thing we're about to debate here. One of the more fun debates, and I think the easier questions to answer, was, are cats or dogs more libertarian? And I'm a little biased because I wrote one of the answers, but you should definitely check that out so you can go see a picture of my cat. So please look up Reason's debate issue from last year. Reason also sponsors the Soho Forum series of debates, which is a monthly event in New York City, but it's the videos are always online. I think they're streamed live. They're always available on Reason's website and our YouTube page as well, and of course, wherever you get your podcasts. Now, our topic for today is, will a national divorce lead to more individual liberty? Would we be better off remaining as the United States, or might we be better off if the United States weren't so united? Arguing for the affirmative is Ryan McMaken. He is the executive editor of the Mises Institute, and he's written a He's written a book about this very subject called Breaking Away. You can read that for free on the Mises Institute website. Arguing for the negative, we have Jonathan Casey. He is the founder and chair of the Libertarian Party's Classical Liberal Caucus. And last year around this time, he participated in a Soho forum about this very issue. So again, if you're interested in that, look it up on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So I'm going to give each gentleman 5-minute opening statements to start. You have your clock right there, so you'll know when you're done. But we will start with Ryan.
All right, thank you very much. They don't reset the clock, so I have to do my own math to figure out how 5 minutes is. Yes, thank you very much. I'm with the Mises Institute. Thanks to the conference for inviting me to come and talk about this topic, which I did write this book on, Breaking Away. You can read it for free on Mises.org, or you can buy a copy on Amazon or through the Mises bookstore. And so just to be clear, basically everything I say here has, if you are interested further, you want to know the source, it's in the book with footnotes, or it's on our site if I wrote about it after the book came out. So plenty of sourcing on all of this, and I like that. I like to go back to my sources on these materials. I will not even assert that George Washington was the first president without providing some sort of backing material for that. So looking at why would national divorce be a good idea? Well, first of all, I just want to note I take exception to the very term national divorce. I know, I get it. It's shorthand, it's convenient, it's a used term, but it creates this lame analogy that the United States is some sort of family and that we're married. And that I've seen, of course, people say, oh, we don't need a divorce, we need a marriage counselor, which is just very, very dumb. The United States, if we're going to talk about breaking it up, this is a contract renegotiation, if anything. It's not a family. We're not united in some sort of mystical bond with each other. And so I just want to dispense with that idea that I subscribe to any of that stuff. I reject all that out of hand, that there's some sort of supernatural union or any kind of genetic or ethnic unity we all enjoy. I don't think that at all. But in terms of ideology as radical classical liberals, which is, of course, what the Mises Institute mostly represents, people like Mises, Gustav de Molinari, Rothbard, these are all people in the tradition of hardcore radical classical liberalism. We're going to draw upon their values in really looking at why is national divorce a good thing, and also look at some of the empirical evidence about what happens when countries break up into smaller pieces. So first of all, we just need to keep in mind the fact that self-determination is an individual right. It is a right that is recognized and has been recognized since the days of the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at the research and at the literature on the topic, basically the Declaration of Independence is recognized as the origin document of the right of self-determination and as a secession movement. And this is hardly some sort of unique theory of mine. We could consult David Armitage, the Harvard historian, on this, not exactly a Rothbardian, who notes simply that, it's obvious that the American Revolution was a secession movement and that the Declaration of Independence and the philosophy involved there is a matter of secession and self-determination. And we see this issue then come up increasingly in the late 18th century, throughout the 19th century, as countries throughout Poland, the Hungarians in Austria-Hungary, the Poles attempting to secede from Russia and the Austrian Empire. We see it anywhere that countries are asserting their right to break free from some larger domineering state where they feel that they are not being appropriately represented. And we note also that we find many examples of secession throughout history that are justified on the grounds of self-determination. We should note that the number of countries in the world has nearly tripled since 1945. There are only about 80 countries at the end of the Second World War. Well, where did all those other countries come from? They came into existence through secession movements, all justified on self-determination. And then, of course, after the end of the Soviet Union, we had another 16 countries that came into existence, all based on and justified by self-determination. They went to votes, they voted to secede, or sometimes they didn't even have a national referendum, as in the case of the Baltics, and they broke off. And they didn't think, oh, gee, do we have a consensus with the Politburo here? Are they going to be upset if we move away? Are we breaking our mystical bond with the Russians by breaking off and forming an independent Estonia? No. The reality is that minorities within a larger union have a right to break off. It's basic self-determination. And then the other main issue here is the issue of what happens when countries get smaller and break off. And as we'll find in a lot of the data here in the books, the empirical evidence shows that as states get smaller, as they break off from other states, as small states compete, and as they face the threat of further secession and being broken up into smaller pieces, they're actually more open to trade, to the migration of workers, to economic development. As we see going back in work done by non-libertarian historians, going back at least 500 years. So this is a basic concept here where we're opposed to state building and centralization of power because it leads to a flowering of freedom. And fundamentally, it's the right thing to do because the right of self-determination is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you for showing up early in the morning. I know most of you were probably out late last night, and so I appreciate you showing up. And I think this is an important topic. We hear in the news all the time. We hear about Texas. We hear about different states, New Hampshire wanting to start its own nation. I think it's an important topic to discuss exactly what would happen and how it applies in the real world. The true measure of whether or not national divorce leads to more individual liberty is what results from national divorce. Not whether our intentions are good or not. It's about what would actually happen in the real world, in the political sphere that we have created in the United States. What would it lead to? So whether or not national divorce would lead to individual liberty is really a question of, well, what do we mean by individual liberty? I know most of us will probably answer the question along the lines of, well, you're allowed to do what you want as long as you don't harm anybody else. But individual liberty is more than just that. It's also the ability to communicate, to collaborate, and to work with other people. And so when you're talking about a national divorce, you're also talking about putting massive barriers and borders in between people. Ryan talked about how smaller states tend to have a more open border system. But the problem is, Ryan, in the United States, between states, we have a perfect open border system. We have no trade tariffs. We have no customs. We don't have to get a visa from going one state to another. These borders that would be imposed by a national divorce would be a net negative to individual liberty. So right off the bat, we're behind the 8 ball on national divorce as far as achieving more individual liberty. The differences, I can't read my notes here, sorry. Jotted them down. The differences between, one of the problems with national divorce is that it often conflates the idea of geographic decentralization with political decentralization. None of us here would say, well, North Korea is more decentralized than the United States. Of course not. It's much smaller than the United States. So inherently, smaller nations are not necessarily more free just because somebody might be able to leave them. One of the problems that I hear a lot with national divorce advocates is they often say, well, if you don't like where you're living now, you can simply move to another state. And I'm sorry, freedom is not being forced to leave your family, forced to leave your job, forced to leave your home. Freedom is being able to live where you want to live, wherever that may be, as long as you aren't harming anybody else, as long as you aren't imposing on anyone else. And I lost track of the time, so I think I've got a few minutes here.
You have 2.5.
2.5, thank you. Where would these borders be? A lot of national divorce advocates ask, was our state that cultural divides in this nation are beyond repair, or we need to divide down smaller, it'll solve our problems, people will be able to choose their preferred form of government. The reality is, where are you going to divide these lines up? Because the real cultural divide in America is not between right and left, or excuse me, not between red states and blue states. The real cultural divide in this country is between rural areas and urban areas. And so wherever you're going to divide the lines up, no state doesn't have rural areas or urban, they both have urban and rural areas. So where are you going to divide this country up along the lines that is actually going to improve individual liberty and improve the cooperation and social cohesion of the United States? Because that's the ultimate, a lot of national divorce advocates say, that the social discord in the United States would be solved by breaking us up. But again, where are you going to draw the line? Even if you draw the line at the state border, you're going to end up with states with a large percentage of Republicans being dominated by Democrats, or vice versa in red states. So ultimately, I think we have to get down to the answer, and I'm hoping Ryan spends a little bit more time on how and why national divorce in the United States will lead to more individual liberty. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by asking Ryan, what exactly are you advocating for here? What does this, in your perfect world, does this look like, 50 independent state governments? Does it go even more local than that? Does it be less local than that with, regional governments? What exactly do you want to see in your perfect world?
Well, let's be clear that I don't think there's something magical about the state level of government. That, you have a right to self-determination as long as you're one of the original American states, or you have statehood or something like that. Certainly, if we look at, we got Locke, we got Molinari, we got Charles Dunoyer, all of these serious liberals would say, no, of course there isn't some magical level of government. Any group of people that can put together, Locke's position was any group of people that can put together some sort of legislative body gets to have self-determination. And this is in direct contradiction to John C. Calhoun, who did believe there was something magical about the state level. Obviously, he wasn't in favor of groups smaller than the state declaring their own independence, because that would have been problematic for the secession issue, or for just anti-slavery people in general. He didn't think they should get their own governments. And so we're talking about a very specific issue where I'm not telling other people how to do things. And just in general, I don't have some national plan for, these people should declare independence and those people should do this. In fact, the essence of my position is the opposite of the anti-national divorce position, in that I'm not telling other people what they should want or how they should govern themselves or what they should do. Because fundamentally saying, you don't get to declare independence because you might govern in a way I don't agree with. This is, of course, a colonialist view. This is the idea that, and it has always been used by central governments to say, well, we can't let those Algerians break off and self-govern because they're barbarians. We can't let those Apaches govern themselves because, well, we just all know they're incapable of civilization. And we hear a lot of the same stuff here now is, the only reason those people want to secede is so they can reinstate slavery, which is basically a laughable position, although I've seen many on the left make this claim. And so I'm not saying, this state, that state, this region, that region. I don't have a map in my head of what's supposed to happen. I'm simply saying that if there are groups of people that, like Mises says, if a group of people get together and they have a plebiscite that says, hey, we wish to secede and form our own government, that group should be taken seriously, and that you should enter into negotiations for how to accomplish that end. So I don't have a specific plan.
Do you have a response to that?
I think you have to have a plan. If you're putting forward a proposition saying we should break up the country, wishful thinking and hoping things work out isn't going to work out. One of the ironies of liberty is that liberty requires a government to protect it. I'm not an anarchist, never will say I am, but I think you have to make sure that you have plans in place for that when you move forward towards a system. If you want actual true political decentralization, that has to be planned out. You simply can't remove restrictions on local governments. Ryan, you stated that we can't tell people how to govern. Absolutely we can tell states not how to govern. I'm sorry, but yes, we should tell states, no, you can't discriminate against blacks. No, you can't ban gay marriage. Yes, absolutely, because we believe in liberty. We believe that, no, government doesn't have any rights. We have all the rights. And so we absolutely have the right to tell government, no, you can't do that.
So, John, you wrote in a Learn Liberty blog post, and I quote here, "Some say that people have a right to live with whatever gun, taxes, / immigration laws they want, and a national divorce would reduce forced associations." And then you kept writing, "But this is a wholesale rejection of libertarianism, which believes human rights are universal and must be protected. But there's always going to be some people who disagree with, perfect libertarianism. So in that sense, is a national divorce a more realistic argument for political harmony because we will have places that presumably do agree on these issues?"
Well, I often hear the argument that, we'll end up with 1,000, the hope that we'll end up with 1,000 Liechtensteins. And that always, to me, To me, that always sounds like Oprah. You get a Liechtenstein, you get a Liechtenstein, everybody gets a Liechtenstein. And I'm sorry, that's not how it's going to work out. It hasn't worked out. Even with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we didn't see further and further decentralization. We haven't seen that at all. In fact, we've seen the exact opposite, where countries are joining NATO, they're joining the European Union. So instead of this further and further decentralization that national divorce advocates often claim would happen, the exact opposite is what happens in the real world. So as far as political discord goes, sure, in some theoretical sense, allowing people to move to the little local tyranny that they want to, fine, I don't care. I'm not in charge of those local tyrannies. What I can do is I can influence what my country is doing and what other governments, what other state governments, what other local governments can or can't do. And I think that is the fundamental principle of liberalism, is to prevent the state from, any state, within as peacefully as we can, prevent them from infringing on rights.
Response there?
Well, I can't believe my opponent is implying that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a bad thing because it allows governments to go off and found their own local tyranny. This was an obviously good thing, this breakup of a large state into a bunch of small states. I don't see the downside in any way of this happening. And the one irony, of course, is that a lot of people who are very much vehemently in favor of Ukraine asserting its independence from Moscow are also anti-secession. Well, the only reason Ukraine exists is because of a plebiscite where it voted to declare secession from the Soviet Union in 1993. And so obviously a good thing. And gee, did all these countries that broke off from the Soviet Union found a bunch of tyrannical local governments that were somehow worse than the Soviet Union? Obviously not. In fact, the Baltic states of Europe are among some of the wealthiest and have seen huge increases in growth in terms of GDP per capita and wealth in those countries. And some joined NATO, some didn't. So? I mean, these countries decided to do different things in different ways. It's called having independence, and it's called self-determination. And this assertion that, yes, of course, we need to have some people telling other people in other countries how to live because they shouldn't discriminate against each other. Well, how come that we're assuming that the United States then is the correct level of government? I can certainly make the case then that, gee, the United States is too independent as is. We should give the United Nations more power to assert that the United States violates human rights on its own. And we should give international organizations more power. The International Criminal Court should be trying Americans and putting them on trial for discrimination and racism. And you can go up the ladder just as much as you can go down the ladder in terms of telling people how to live. And this is why the liberals consistently, from Jefferson on, have said we need more local self-determination, especially in the United States, where each state is a republic with a legislature, with a Supreme Court. We're acting like this is some sort of tribal government where there's no rule of law. But that's, of course, not the reality at all. So one minute we're told that democracy and republics work very, very well. But the next minute, as soon as one of those republics wants to be a republic that's not directly under the US federal government, well, then suddenly republics don't work anymore. And we need some Supreme Court people in Washington to tell them how to do everything.
So I often hear, people advocating for a national divorce. They talk about how, our politics is so, angry and vitriolic, and that if we, had these smaller states, that we would have more political harmony. But even in, deep red states like Alabama, 30% of that state is still Republicans. And even in deep blue New York City, 30% are still Republicans. I meant 30% of Alabama's Democrats, obviously. But so even, with a national divorce, won't those 30% of people in those, smaller places, there's still going to be political discord from those 30%ers, right?
Yes, there will always be minorities within every group that seeks to declare independence. And of course, this applied to the United States as well when it declared independence from the British Empire. The question is, should the presence of the Loyalists have invalidated the American independence movement? Because this was a significant part of the population. And so if the answer is, well, anytime there's some minorities who don't want to secede, well, it's off the table, well, then of course the United States would not exist as an independent country because the Loyalists were no small, insignificant part of the United States at that time. Most people agree, well, they had to go. They had to move to Canada. Many went back. And it is unfortunate the way many of them were treated in terms of the day-to-day treatment that many Loyalists received. However, that just wasn't sufficient to invalidate the fact that Americans had a right to self-determination in that way. The answer to that, though, is to simply allow further breakup of these jurisdictions after they secede. And this is why Gustave de Molinari talked about the right of double secession. And this is, okay, you can have a region break off from the central government, but then you can have a municipality break off from that. And this is the reality, of course, in Europe, and what historians have shown has been the great contributor to a lot of the capitalist growth that occurred over the last 500 years, is that there was a lot of fluidity in the borders, there was a lot of ability to break off, to form different pieces, to form different alliances, and this in the aggregate, and you can see this in the work of Douglas North, Hayek actually says this, that he says, oh gee, I think that most of Europe's growth in capitalism was due to its quote unquote political anarchy, by which he meant rapid and massive decentralization during that period. And we find it in the work of Ralph Raico in his lengthy essay on the European miracle. Where did all of this economic growth come from? How did Europe get so rich? It's because of constant movements toward breaking up pieces of Europe into smaller pieces. And it was not some fait accompli where, okay, that's enough decentralization now, we got enough. Let's get everything under control. No, it was much more dynamic than that, and it led to a great flowering of economic growth and freedom.
I want to rewind a little bit to the previous question where I stated that, or you stated that, that I implied that the Soviet Union breakup was a bad thing. No, what I am stating is that if you're going to have secession, you need to have a plan in place for how individual liberty will be protected. Because when a country breaks away, for example, in the state of Texas right now, we have a situation going on in the border where our state government is trying to enforce draconian laws against immigrants. For example, our state governor Abbott has stated that police are allowed to arrest any illegal immigrant that they pull over. Well, let me ask you something. How do you think they're going to determine who's an illegal immigrant who's driving around? And so you're telling me that that it'd be better for Texans to break away and not have the Fourth Amendment protecting people in my state? No, I'm sorry. I'm not going to support a secession unless I know how individual liberties will be protected. And so in situations like the Soviet Union, you have these breakups, you can understand, okay, what laws are going to be in place, what restrictions on government are going to be placed. Then you can make a call and determination on whether secession is appropriate. Because again, there are cases, even Ryan, you'll admit, there are cases where secession has led to less individual liberty. That's the real world. Sometimes things work out in one direction, sometimes they work out in another. So I think, and as far as geographic decentralization always leading to political decentralization, when you look at the numbers, when you take a look at the Cato Health or Human Freedom Index, and you compare it to the size of a nation, what you find is that it's only responsible for about 2% of the variation between the countries. So the country's size is only responsible for about 2% of its Human Freedom Index score. Why are we focusing on the 2% when there's 98% to be talked about?
I think what's interesting about this issue is that it seems like the case for a national divorce is basically a case for localism. And it seems like there are good arguments for that, right? Like if my job is, trying to be a florist in Louisiana, but because of occupational licensing, I can't do that, it's good that I can move to another state and do that. Now, obviously, I'm talking about the state level there, but in theory, the federal government, which has the constitutional protections of liberty, but it can also take away those protections as well. So, isn't there a good pro-liberty case for the kind of localism that is engendered by a national divorce?
You can have localism without national divorce. You can pass a law that says, okay, states are responsible for this now. You can end federal laws and stop them. So this idea that you have to have national divorce to achieve political decentralization is just wrong. But back to your point about whether licensing and being a florist and you can move from one place to another, again, true freedom is not being able to move away from your home and your job and your family to someplace better. That's not freedom. Freedom is where you choose to live. As long as you're not harming anybody else, that's freedom. And I get that, yes, we should absolutely have the ability for people to move from one place to the other. But again, most people don't move from one place to the other simply for political reasons. There are many more motivations for it. And the level of burden on them from government needs to be pretty high to force somebody to move away from those things I've mentioned.
Ryan, do you have a response there?
Well, again, it just comes back to me not telling these people if they have enough freedom. Oh, you over there, you have enough freedom now, and you have a vote in the legislature, so you're not allowed to break off and have self-determination. I mean, even Mises noted this in Liberalism when he says, he's writing in 1927 and talking about these groups within Russia, the Soviet Union, that want to break off. He's saying, look, even if Russia converted over to some sort of constitutional republic with a national legislature, that still would not be sufficient reason to prevent any of these groups from within the Soviet Union from wanting to get to declare independence. This is just a right that they have regardless of the system of government in place and whether they have some representation in the national government. Plus, as he also notes in another place, if you're in a permanent minority situation, the fact is you don't really have much ability to make your will known as a minority group. So if you're in a permanent minority and you see yourself as, okay, well, we're always going to lose elections from now on, we have really no hope of getting a president we like, of appointing people to the Supreme Court that we like, which is accepted, right? Over the long term, it doesn't manifest itself immediately, but when you are in a minority status, over time, this essentially means that you get ignored. That's just the way democratic systems work, as well as all republics, because even republics then, even though they're supposed to have some minority protective systems in place, over time, all of your appointments, all of your elected officials, they favor the majority group. And so what means do you have then of asserting any sort of self-determination in that situation than to break off and have some sort of self-government in that case? And so again, shouldn't be in the position of saying, oh, yeah, I can't let you go until I know what sort of government you're going to have in place. This is, of course, what the British said all the time about Africans and their Asian colonies is, well, you colonies, you can't break off until we know that you're sufficiently enlightened to govern yourself. But I deny that the British were in a position to really dictate to people in other parts of the world how they were allowed to govern themselves.
So I had a great economics professor at the University of Rochester who said that the Constitution was the world's greatest free trade agreement. And that there's, it's great that, Washington state can't put a tariff or an import ban on goods from the state of Florida. And you basically are saying that you want to not throw away the Constitution, but that you want to break up that great free trade agreement. What is your argument for saying that once we have all these small states, they're necessarily, are we going to lose that free trade? Are we going to lose this free movement of people across the country, across the United States, if we do break up into these smaller states?
Well, if the United States were a compact that only had free trade among all the states, I wouldn't have any problem with it at all. I mean, it would be a great document. Heck, you could even have it where the United States functioned essentially as some sort of military defense league. But the fact of the matter is that members should have some mechanism for leaving. And that's your primary means of actually instilling discipline upon that group as well, is that, oh, you cannot start coming up with new powers for yourself, you can't start telling the member states how to do things, but as long as people want to be a member of this union, then they get free trade with all the other members. I don't see a downside with that sort of thing at all. I'm talking about situations where you have one large central government that's telling all parts of the entire union, the entire region, how they get to conduct themselves internally. And I think a lot of British, say in the British Empire, would have been perfectly fine with some sort of free trade agreement within the Commonwealth as well. But that's very different from having a situation where you get to meddle in the constant internal affairs of every corner of the empire.
John, are you skeptical of that?
Yes. I think that you have to look at, again, I think you have to look at the political environment we're in. The right and the left are both going very illiberal directions. And you're telling me that you're hoping that eventually that they lead to this free trade agreement. But have you looked at what Republicans want to do? Have you looked at what Democrats want to do? And at the end of the day, who's going to be running these local governments? The very same people who are already in power. And I'm sorry, but giving the power to Republicans and Democrats to rewrite the Constitution in their own image is simply not going to work out for individual liberty.
So, my question is, Why wouldn't a national divorce advance individual liberty? Wouldn't, if there are a few, libertarian enclaves spread throughout the country, dotted around, wouldn't that be better than having no libertarian enclaves?
Well, first of all, I think, again, most people don't move to go be in a political, I don't want to say cult, but a political compound. That is not the role, that is not, liberty is not supposed to be restricted to a few little dotted space. We're supposed to spread it. In fact, the best defense of our liberty is to spread our ideas. Sure, if there was a place that, a utopia we could all go to, sure, maybe we would be better off. And if somebody presented me with a plan, say, here's New Hampshire, here's our new constitution, here's what the individual liberties going to be protected, here's how we're going to do it, and they presented that plan to me, I would start to consider it. But again, no one is presenting a plan for national divorce or secession that increases individual liberty.
Response there?
Well, we can speculate about what other countries might do if they had more self-determination. If we actually look at the quantitative analysis that's been done, the empirical data that's come out over the last 30 or 40 years, and there was a great flowering of literature on this that came out after the end of the Cold War, after you had a lot of these countries breaking off, is they looked, what happens in these countries? Well, what they found is that what really happens is that these smaller countries especially, what they do is they compete with each other in terms of lowering taxes and advancing more free trade. And part of the reason is just simply it's a matter of survival. So it doesn't even matter really what the ideology, the stated ideology of this regime is in many cases. In order to maintain their standard of living, in order to have any success as a country, they have to be open to free trade. They have to be open to low taxation. And this is why small countries are usually the ones that object to this idea of a standard tax rate. You've seen this, Janet Yellen loves to talk about it, and the EU loves to talk about it. So there's too many different tax rates in the world. And we've got these countries, they keep undercutting us. Countries like Ireland and Hungary, they adopt low tax rates, and then they suck capital investment into those countries, and that's just wrong. What we need to do is develop one global minimum tax. And this will, of course, make the world much more efficient, and everyone will have similar tax rates. This, of course, what they're really saying is taxes are too low in parts of the world, and we need to make sure and bring those tax rates up. And so when you do see all of these efforts to actually go out and assert more self-determination in terms of tax rates, in terms of trade, because these small countries want it the most. They know that the only way they can actually compete is by opening themselves up to additional trade, and it's just essential. So they end up doing that, regardless of what their constitutions might say and so on. If they want to stay rich, if they want to increase their standard of living, in order to get reelected in most cases, they have to embrace more openness. And this is just what the empirical data shows over the last 30 years, and it really doesn't depend all that much on what someone has to say about it in Congress or some local legislature. It's just simply an imperative, and especially if we look at the larger historical situation in Europe, it's that decentralization that has driven most of that.
So we're going to get to 2-minute closing statements in a second here, but before we get to that, my last question for both of you, perhaps my hardest question, is what is something that your opponent said here today that you agreed with or thought was a good point?
He should go first.
That's funny because that was my exact statement that I was going to say. Yeah, I think that it is important to have these discussions. I think it's important to look at what the other side is saying, and I think that there are things we need to learn from the data that shows the decentralization that geographic decentralization can affect political decentralization, but we have to make sure that we have to understand that they are not one-to-one. There is absolutely a case to be made that we should localize more government, but the fact is we can do that now. We have a system of government where we can pass responsibilities down to lower levels. If we want to do that, why have a national voice? Why not just pass some bills, pass some laws?
So, of course, I agree with my opponent that I'm concerned about things of, well, if there are people in other parts of the world that are doing things that I find abhorrent. Now, of course, I think it's been greatly overstated that if some portion of the United States breaks off, it's going to turn into some sort of third world hellhole, which is, by the way, what Joy Reid said recently, is that if any of these states break off, it's going to become this hellhole. And, well, okay, I guess you can assert that. But the fact of the matter is the world is full of places that do things that I disagree with. But the answer to them is not what the US regime has been telling us needs to be done for the last 25, 30, actually forever, which is that, oh, there's this other part of the world, Iraq, Syria, you name it. They're doing stuff that we find objectionable. So you know what the answer is? Send in an army. Do some humanitarian intervention. And that's essentially where the argument leads, is that, oh, these other parts of the world might do things that we don't like. So we need humanitarian intervention, even better to have it really statutorily put in place at some constitutional level rather than just recognizing that country is foreign. But I get the impulse, of course. So I am concerned about these things too. I just recognize that the answer to it is not to intervene in some way using coercion to ensure that other people do these sorts of things. There are other methods that can be employed and have been employed historically.
Okay, 2-minute closing statements. We're going to start with Ryan so that Jonathan gets the last word.
All right. Just simply that this is the sort of thing where you do it because it's the right thing to do. That we shouldn't be in the business, really, of determining how the rest of the world should be doing things. And this has always been one fundamental problem of Congress, is that Alaska decides they want to do something, and then you get 535 members of Congress, minus the 3 people from Alaska, determining what happens in Alaska. And that doesn't strike me as particularly democratic or really cognizant of what's going on in one of these particular states. These places need to have some ability in order to, some means to which assert themselves more independently. And some degree of self-determination is that. It might be full independence, or maybe it could be a rewriting of the current union so that it's just a free trade agreement. But I would say if we really wanted to see what the situation was, if we really wanted to develop a roadmap of how would this independence look, do something that is written into the Swiss Constitution, which is that unless you reapprove the Constitution every 20 years, let's say, and of course Jefferson wanted a new Constitution every 19 years, let's throw it out to the states and have everyone affirmatively vote whether or not they wish to remain in the United States. Why is the burden always on people to withdraw? Why don't we get everyone to opt back in? And then we'll know who really wants to be in, the people who opt in and the people who opt out. And if some people decide not to opt in, then we'll have to see where we go from there. But rather than saying, hey, you need to organize something so you can opt out, how about we just ask, since we know everybody loves America so much and everyone fears national divorce so much, let's ask them to opt in, and then we'll know more about where we stand. And then we'll see a lot more in terms of how people view their own self-determination rights. Thank you very much.
Got the last.
I spent a little time this past week thinking about what I wanted to leave you with. I thought about, Ryan would accuse this of me of being sentimental, but I thought about talking about how I didn't think the American experiment, the greatest political experiment we've ever seen, was over. I think that's true, but I don't think that's what I want to leave you with. I thought about talking about whether or not, about checks and balances, that it's good to have different levels of government that restrict the ones below them. That's right, but I don't necessarily want that to be what I leave you with. Ultimately, as individuals, we have to make determinations about the real political world around us, and we have to look at what's actually going to happen. And for me, the reason why I oppose national divorce is because I see a path forward that is extremely dangerous in our current political climate. What we have to do before anything else, regardless of how geographically small or large our government is, we have to influence our political culture, and we have to get out there and spread our message. That's the answer. Because regardless of how big or small a government is, if our political culture says we want to rule over other people, you're not going to protect individual liberty.
That's great. Well, I think often I watch debates and I see the debaters talking past each other, or they spend the whole time arguing about definitions, and that gets really boring and technical. So thank you both. That has been very fantastic, and I appreciate the substance of both of your debates. It was a great argument. Again, if you want to read more about this, there is more on Reason Magazine and Reason.com about a national divorce, the arguments for and against. If you're interested, you can read Ryan's book, Breaking Away, for free, again, on the Mises Institute website. And again, Jonathan was at a Soho Forum debate about this very topic about a year ago. You can see that on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for the Soho Forum. Let's hear it again for both our debaters. Thank you. Well done. Well done. Thank you, everyone.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, Jedi Master Yoda said, "Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering." I now have the pleasure of welcoming to the stage an even bigger Star Wars nerd than myself, Stephen Kent, author of How the Force Can Fix the World, a PR specialist at the Consumer Choice Center, and writer of the Geeky Stoics newsletter. Stephen will explain how we can avoid succumbing to the dark side of the Force and accept that which is outside of our control. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Kent to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right. All right, is that thing on and ready to go? Hello, LibertyCon. This is my favorite convention single year. We've got student activists that come here from all around the world and advocating for our ideas in places that are a little less friendly sometimes than things can be here in the United States. I will admit to living in the Washington, D.C. bubble and enjoying all of its different comforts, and we have it incredibly good here. And what Students for Liberty activists and organizers are doing all around the world is what reminds me all the time that this is the good fight. So thank you so much for being here and taking the time to stay all the way through Sunday and hear this talk. We all come to this movement for different reasons. We have different points of entry. I've always felt like a little bit of a weirdo in that I didn't read Hayek or Rand until I was at least 30. I still haven't even seen Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, God forbid, and I was not involved in SFL in college. I didn't know that it existed. I really wish that I had, because I just felt like a lost and confused Republican. You know, I didn't belong and fit in with the college GOP kids. I didn't get along with the college Democrats either, and I knew why. It's because we all learn liberty in different places, through different formats. The ideas of the Enlightenment and reason and spontaneous order, trying to think of another great concept, but these things are seeded throughout the popular culture. We pick them up in movies, books, televisions, and more. And for me, I feel as though I learned at the age of 13 about the forces of darkness and order versus chaos and the will to power and the corrupting influence of power from this man, Boromir. He gave his life. I learned a lot from watching this guy, Boromir, Steward of Gondor. He really wanted to fight back against the forces of darkness that were going to consume his kingdom. And right, it got the best of him in the end. Now, I was not really super interested in politics. I was watching the Lord of the Rings movies and what was happening in Middle-earth with incredible interest. The forces of darkness that were rising out of Mordor that were going to overtake Middle-earth, and they posed a threat to destroy liberty for the men, the elves, the goblins, the hobbits, and the dwarves. It was a threat to everybody. And when I was watching those movies, I started to become a little bit more of a believer in all of the things that we now talk about today. But in Middle-earth, there's this one ring be able to stop that rising tide of darkness. The one ring. I even got it for this. If you have the ring, you're going to be able to supposedly have the power, or at least think that you have the power, to stop those things from happening, to be able to push back on it. And then when I think back on the conversations that were being had in those college GOP and Democrat meetings, it was very much about the ring. We were talking about winning elections. We were talking about owning the libs or finding a way to push back on the Republicans and the conservatives. It was about power at its core. And I just really wasn't interested in that. You see this very much in American politics today. It's a conversation that's picked up a lot of steam. It's already overtaken most of Europe and parts of South America, this populist tide, where and then you have conservatives and libertarians who we've always kind of had a tepid agreement, or at least for the past couple of decades, that the ring was dangerous and that maybe it should not be wielded because it might one day be wielded against you. But in recent years, the conservatives, our friends a little bit further to the right, have gotten a little bit nervous with the state of the culture and society, and they are now starting to have a very different conversation amongst themselves. They feel that small government philosophy has maybe come to betray them, right? That the other side is going to be using government power, and their values are not holding up in the court of public opinion, and virtue and liberty and all the things that we tend to care about might not survive on its own unless you use a little bit of healthy force. They are now having the exact conversation that Boromir wanted to have in Rivendell when he said, why not use the ring and use it against them? And I empathize with that. I really, really do. There are things in the culture and in the world that I am afraid of, and I do not want to see be normalized or be, sanctioned by any government. And I empathize with Boromir. Again, like even in the moment when he tries to kill Frodo, take the ring from him, he says, I ask only for the strength to defend my people. Noble impulse, right? Like that's a noble and worthwhile instinct taken to a dark place. And earlier in the movie, you have Gandalf, who is offered the ring by Frodo. He doesn't want to take the quest to Mordor, and he says, don't tempt me, because he would like the ring too. I would use the ring from a desire to do good, but through me, it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. I love that line, because it's this reminder that you may have plans for how to use power, but power has plans for how to use you, right? Power is its own sort of force that you have to be able to control over time. Now, you might find this surprising because, the battle over the super weapon of government is something that just continues generation over generation. And super weapons are important, right? This is my favorite super weapon. I've always wanted one. I'm a little bit more of a Star Wars fan, a lot more of a Star Wars fan than I am a Lord of the Rings fan. I am the author of How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. It's very much like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, except it's about the economics of slavery on Tatooine and the fall of the Jedi Order. So it's something that you should pick up. I actually have a couple free copies here if you want to grab one before they're gone. And in my book, I look at the impact that the Death Star had on the galaxy, the effect of building the Death Star. Because why do, in the original Star Wars movie, 1977, Darth Vader and Tarkin activate the Death Star? They have an agenda to rule through fear. You see, the galaxy is incredibly fractious at this time. The Empire is relatively new in the grand scope of things. It's only been around for about a decade, and there are rebellions popping up throughout the galaxy, and they're having trouble, trying to play whack-a-mole and put them all out. And so they have this relatively reasonable idea through Tarkin that Well, we'll commit one targeted act of genocide and scare everybody into submission, and it will work, right? It's a really, really big galaxy. And so they think that this will work. But Leia knows something that they don't. And it's something that all of you know as well. She says to Tarkin, the more you tighten your grip, the more star systems are going to slip through your fingers. Yes. More control does not always mean more order. It's like plugging the top of a volcano. The pressure is just gonna burst out somewhere else, always. But I didn't even start learning about liberty in the original movie. I was kind of too young when I was watching those to kind of take in some of those ideas. It was in, of course, the Star Wars prequels where I was learning about these ideas and thinking about them a little bit more deeply. There's episode 2. I was pretty much the same age because they were coming out at the same time as the Lord of the Rings films. Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, comes out. And there is this scene in the film. If you haven't seen the movie, yeah, exactly. You know the meme if you haven't seen the movie. There's this wonderful scene where Anakin Skywalker, the boy who's going to become Darth Vader, is on a date with his crush, Padme Amidala, a senator. Anakin doesn't like politics. Padme loves it. And she's poking fun at him, and she says, all right, fine, describe the kind of system that you would want, Mr. Smart Guy. I'm going to do this whole scene for you. And he says, I want a system where the politicians get together and discuss what's in the best interest of the people, and then they do it. She says, that's what we do. The problem is that people don't always agree. Well, then they should be made to, is what he says. And he has a little grin. It's very nice. And she goes, who's going to make them? You? No, not me. Someone wise. Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me. Anyone want to know what he says in response? Anyone got it? Well, if it works. I love that line because I think it's actually incredibly honest. It's George Lucas telling us, I think, something more true than most people will tell you about human nature and the people who we are neighbors with. It's that a lot of people really do think this way. Raise your hand if you know somebody who is a if it works person. There's somebody in your family. I'm raising my hand because if I wake up in a bad mood and I don't like what I saw on the news, I feel this way. I don't always have that totalitarian instinct in check. It's really, really hard. Let's see what we got. And so, if you don't know Star Wars, though, you might have watched this channel called Jubilee. I know it's really popular with younger kids these days, but the Jubilee YouTube channel, they have these debates. And recently, they put 3 capitalists against 3 communists. And Hannah Cox was in the debate. She's a wonderful advocate for liberty. She's been to LibertyCon many times. And then in the middle, we have our communist, this sweet, dainty, kind girl, right? She just seems like a nice person. She goes, I believe that communism could still work. And then, the kicker, people just need to be taught. She said, if we could just teach people to embrace the vision, right, behind it. I mean, that's the same guiding idea as then they should be made to. It's kind of shocking in its similarity. So if you're wondering, who is this guy and like, why is he up here talking about this stuff? Because it's kind of niche. It's just to remind you that you can talk to people about our ideas through more than political theory. I admire the instinct to share Smith and Hayek and Rand with people. I think it's great. But people are really drawn to story and narrative and plot and big character decisions. That's why Atlas Shrugged is so popular, right? Because it is fiction. There are other ways to communicate many of our ideas with people and to get them invested in these stories. Because I have to tell you, when you're trying to persuade people, I believe that what we are selling is not really that sexy. Freedom is a thing that you go for once you've lost it. But when you have some freedom, what you really want is some kind of stability. And our opponents, at least in American politics, Republicans and Democrats, those kids at those college meetings that I was going to, what they're selling is sexy. They're selling legislation. They're selling control. They're selling regulations over things that scare you. And we are selling the idea that the Hobbit should travel all the way across Mordor with the ring, nearly get killed a bunch of times, and struggle, and probably have fewer friends than if they would just join a side in the battle between one side and the other. It's actually a really, really hard journey that we're investing in and asking people to go on with us. And you know this, like when our opponents are out there talking to people, they are selling them the idea that through us, eventually things will be okay and a little bit more calm. And it kind of takes me back to the Death Star a little bit, because again, taking the ring, wielding the Death Star against people that we don't like or ideas that we don't like is just a lot easier. It's a lot more simple. But we know that it doesn't work, and that's what makes us different. We know that when the Empire uses the Death Star against Alderaan, it actually makes the rebellion stronger than it ever was before. You see this particularly like in the Rogue One movie. You have factions of the rebellion. They can't unite around how to fight against the fascism of that empire. And so they blow up this planet, and now the rebellion's like, this is a life or death situation. We're going to die and lose all of our freedom unless we stand up, and they unite. More people join the rebellion. More people fight back. And you know this to be true. Like when people win elections, when they finally get control of the bureaucracy, when they're finally able to enact their control freak and fund police tendencies and force ideas and legislation down on people, shove it down their throats, there's a backlash. It might take a while, but there will always be a backlash. And freedom demands that there be a backlash. And we generally just try to avoid that situation altogether by letting people live the lives that they would like to live. What you learn from stories like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings is that the desire for control is incredibly natural. There are areas in your own private life, in mine, where you probably don't live out libertarian or liberal principles in every single way, because there are always instances where we can convince ourselves that a little bit more power would be beneficial. But I ask you just to remember, as you leave this conference and go back to your lives, that while you may have plans for power, it always has plans for you too. And so what are you going to do with that? Take the ring. I propose you give it away. Thank you. All right, come on up. Spike going, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much, Stephen. How's everyone doing? Again, that was a very, very good first try. How's everyone doing? There it is. There it is. I know. Last night was we all had fun last night. So we're here, and unfortunately, very soon, LibertyCon will be ending. But I have some fantastic news for you. We're gonna keep the party going later this year in Vegas for Freedom Fest. That's right, from July 10th to July 13th at the Caesars in Las Vegas, Nevada, we are going to be having Freedom Fest. Now, I wear many hats, as you have seen across this event, but one of those hats is I'm an ambassador for Freedom Fest. And Freedom Fest, thank you. That's great. Again, I will always stop if you want to clap for me, but I appreciate that. Freedom Fest is partnered with Students for Liberty to promote each other's events. And so now we're going to be talking about what we're going to be doing July 10th through 13th in Las Vegas. We are going to have over 250 of the leaders and most exciting people in the Liberty world. People like Kennedy, people like Ice-T is going to be there, people like Steve Forbes, and even Spike Cohen is going to be there. Yes, wow. Thank you so much for that completely unprompted applause. I love all of you. And so I would love for all of you to be there. I will be happy to see you there. If you go to freedomfest.com, you can be a part of it when we do it in July. But wait, there's more. Right now, we are about to draw from this raffle, and one of you is going to win 2 free tickets to Freedom Fest, and Stephen has already said that he is going to draw. He is our, I guess, Vanna White?
Here we go.
Or I guess I'm the Vanna White.
I
So I'm going to
use the force.
shake it first, showing that we have no pre-selected winners,
No
and that you
cheating.
can completely trust us, and then I'm going to look away, because that will also prove...
It's rigged.
Yeah, it's
Rigged.
completely rigged.
All right.
No, it's not.
It's not rigged.
It's not rigged.
Can't say that. Okay. All right, here we go. And our winner is a name I can pronounce. David King.
David
we
King.
love it. Fairforall.org.
Is David here? David, give it up for David.
You, sir, have 2 free tickets to Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. It's such a good time.
David, you just
Congrats.
won 2 free tickets to the most exciting thing that's going to be happening from July 10th to July 13th in the Liberty world. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And thank all of you, and continue enjoying LibertyCon. Love y'all.
Hi, everyone. This is my personal panel that I've been looking the most forward to this weekend, but under the guise of protecting consumer welfare, many occupational licensing reform turns out to just be protectionism by corporations to keep out competition completely. This, of course, leads to decreased supply and massively inflated prices for a vast majority of different things, ranging from healthcare to just getting your hair cut, and it's insane. But luckily, we have an amazing panel here today to discuss this, moderated by R Street fellow Shoshana Wiseman, with guests including 2020 presidential candidate Joe Jorgensen, Reason editor Emma Camp, and CEO Tony Lopez. Thank you so much.
I want to see how I can support you.
Thank you.
That music was kind of intense. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. But thank you all for coming today. And I'm excited to talk about my favorite topic for those of you who see me tweet way too much and swear a lot about occupational licensing. But I'm really excited to talk about it with our panel. There's so much to say about it, and there's so many sides of it, from like, what should we license, to why do we license things? Is it the best system? Obviously not always. When immigrants come here, they can't get licensed because we don't have processes for that. People are trained in prisons to do jobs that they can't do when they get out. So there's so many sides of it, and I'm really excited to get to it. So first, I want to start off with a question to our panel. We have so many regulations in the United States that we don't even know how many there are, which is a famous thing that's bad. So out of all those many, many regulations, why is it worth focusing on the problems with occupational licensing?
So I think I would start out with just how many people it affects, right? So it's about 1 in 4 American workers have to get some kind of occupational license. And the really big issue with that is that it ends up infringing on pretty fundamental liberties, right? Which is the personal liberty to, the freedom to earn a living. And so I think that's why we should focus on this more than other regulations, just simply because of how many people it affects.
So I'll speak to licensing from I guess, a boring macroeconomic perspective. So I apologize about that. But what ends up happening with licensing is you really handicap the small businesses. And when we look at what's happening in this country today, we have a debt to GDP ratio that is over 100%. This is a huge problem in this country. So what do we need to do? We need to increase the GDP. We need to increase productivity. We need to enhance our small businesses, give them incentives to start and create productivity, create GDP. But licensing will do the opposite. It will handicap them. So we really need to take this issue seriously and consider all aspects.
Well, I'm glad you're here to talk about macro because I much prefer micro. I'm going to quote my running mate again and hopefully not mangle his saying as much as I did last night, but Harry Brown used to say that the government breaks your leg and then expects you to be grateful when it hands you a crutch. And that's exactly what's going on with licensing laws. Thanks to licensing laws, people have a hard time getting out of poverty. People who are in poverty, by definition, are there because they don't have the money, which means they don't have the money to go to expensive classes. Oftentimes, these classes are run by the very competitors who really don't want to see any more competition. And so then the government comes along and says, oh, well, too bad, I guess you're not smart enough or skilled enough to get a job. And it's like, no, you're keeping me from getting a job. And then the government says, well, here's welfare for you. And the people who are receiving the welfare would much rather be working. And we've got a government who, once again, is in charge of everything, trying to be benevolent.
So occupational licensing occurs at all levels. You have lawyers and doctors, but you also have florists and fortune tellers. The fortune teller one is really funny because you just need to be a certified fortune teller to work. It's all local licensing. Most are state, lots of localities want to make sure you're a legitimate fortune teller. So at the side of like over-regulating doctors, making it harder to have access to care on that side, or whether it's like even certified public accountants, making it harder for people to have access to financial information, or at the other end, the fortune tellers and the florists. In each of your views, which kind of licensing is the biggest problem? Is it at one end, at the other end? Is it in the middle? Is it kind of a mix of all of them?
Well, I'm not sure that I can quite quantify which is worse because you can find different ways to be infuriated about either. Like on the one hand, say doctors that limit the scope of practice for nurses makes it really difficult for people to get essential health care, but also it's particularly infuriating to see, just how many hours you need to be a licensed hair braider. So I think I'd rather focus on like a particular form of occupational licensing that really gets my goat, and that's Washington, D.C. requiring an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree with a concentration in early childhood education to be a preschool teacher. And I think the particular irony with that one is that the people who sold it said basically, look, every child deserves high quality daycare. And the argument is that, if you have this extra level of education, it will guarantee that. Which, for one, I'm sure a daycare teacher who's been doing his or her job for 20 years knows a thing or two about early childhood education. But then also the irony is that, when you require this onerous licensing, daycare in DC is already topping $20,000 a year on average. It'll only cause the prices to increase by further artificially restricting the supply of daycare teachers. And so what it'll actually end up doing is meaning that fewer kids end up in high quality daycare because their parents are gonna go, well, it costs way too much, so one of us should just quit our jobs and stay home with the kids.
So I don't know which one's worse. I'm very much a fan of let the business decide, let the consumer decide. If you go to a doctor and that doctor doesn't have a license or a degree or a certain certification, that's your choice to go to that doctor and maybe pay a smaller fee because they don't have that. That is your choice, and that is their choice as a business, as a doctor, to operate in that environment. They may not get as many clients, or they may get many clients. Let the market decide, right? Let the free market decide what happens. If that business owner looks around and says, wait a minute, I'm not getting so many clients, and maybe I need to go get a license as a result to get more clients, then that's free market. They should look around them and say, if I want to be in this business, I need to go ahead and get that license. Let them decide. Don't leave it to the government to impose certain licenses, right? Let the consumer vote with their feet. Let them go to the grocery store and purchase organic vegetables. Now, they may pay more for those organic vegetables because they're, those farmers may be licensed and there's a higher cost to producing organic fruits and vegetables. That's great. But let the consumer vote with their feet and with their dollars whether they want to purchase organic or not. Do not impose that requirement from a government perspective to all farmers and say all farmers must be organic because that's goodness, that the government decides that's goodness, right? Leave it to the consumer to vote with their dollars and with their own feet.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, for sure. So sorry, I know that we had so much in between. So basically, which do you think is a bigger problem? Like the licensing of doctors, or the over-licensing of doctors, or like the florists and the, everything there, or the in the middle space?
Well, I hate to be such a utilitarian, but you got to look at what works. And a recent study showed that licensing of dentists didn't do any good. And if you think about it, our country is already so overregulated with who gets into school, how many dentists and doctors there are, who gets to pass the boards. I mean, they've already gone through so many steps. That's essentially licensing built in. But, it's funny that you talk about medical versus the florists. To show how arbitrary it is, some people at Cato had pointed out that in Florida, it was something like it took 110 hours for emergency medical technicians to get licensed, but something like 1,800 hours for an interior designer. So that shows that safety is not the #1 concern. It's basically people up for a power grab. And I'd like to expand on what you were saying about choice. It really goes beyond choice. It goes to competition. And what's very frustrating is so many of the people who want the licensing laws, which tend to be from the left, they're the ones who are called progressives. But the way that we become progressive is through competition. And I teach psychology. One of the classes I teach sometimes is social psychology, which is about the most liberal, dare I say fascist arm of the psychology fields. At one social psychology conference, they asked how many people were liberal, how many were conservative. Of course, they haven't heard of libertarians yet. But like out of 800 social psychologists there, it was a ridiculous number, like there were only 6 conservatives. The rest of them are liberal. And yet, despite that, my social psychology book points out that you've got cooperation and competition, and that competition brings progress. And they use that word, and yet the progressives are not trying to get the competition. And the example I use in class about competition is, hey, how much do you like your iPhones? The reason you have your iPhone is because Steve Jobs and Bill Gates pretty much hated each other and wanted to outdo each other, and it was through competition. And so what's ironic, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to give such a long answer.
I love it.
But what's ironic is that having licensing is supposed to protect people, but instead of protecting people, it's keeping us from this healthy competition that's getting us better services, getting us better products. It's often been said that the reason computers could accelerate, progress so fast in technology is that government couldn't keep up with technology to kind of legislate it to slow down like it does with the other fields. So thanks to the government thinking they're helping us, they're actually making things worse.
So one thing I'll say, I love spite. I think spite is a great motivator. So when you have 2 industry leaders who hate each other, that's great. We need more of that. Apparently that's why Shrek got created. There was some spite and stuff like that. So Shrek is another great product of spite. So I wanted to throw that in there. But actually one thing that you're talking about that I really like too is the barrier to entry side, the upfront regulation rather than the after regulation. So I've looked at a couple of studies in, I think, New Jersey, California, and some other jurisdictions. And on average, I think it's like 33% of salon foot tubs where you get your pedicures have bacteria that's banned by the government. The government says you're not supposed to have this because it can cause infections. So you have to get all this experience and all this training to become a cosmetologist and to get to work. But once you're there, you can kind of do whatever you want. And I've seen this in other fields too, where there's not a lot of enforcement. There's just that upfront regulation. So I'm curious, the Institute for Justice has this upside down triangle of regulation showing the least restrictive means, which is like nothing, of course, and just competition. Then you have mandatory registration. You can have health inspections. do you all think, or I'd like to know from each of you, if you think that there's better barriers in some cases, like if you would prefer more active health inspections in certain cases instead of licensing, or just less upfront barriers and more other kinds of regulation, if that's something that, not in every case, I don't think we need to worry about florists too much, but in other cases, if that's something worth looking into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great alternative in a lot of cases. And I think why we don't see it so much is that the government is fundamentally kind of lazy and inefficient, and it's much easier to pat yourself on the back and say, you know, we've guaranteed consumer safety by having all of these upfront licensing requirements that are often sold, although that's not actually why they're there, but are often sold as being necessary to protect safety. You know, we have these upfront regulations and then we can step back because it's much harder to actually do the health inspections, to hire someone, to go out, to make sure that, you know, there's actual, people's safety is actually being protected. And so I think shifting to a, you know, perhaps slightly harder to maintain, but, you know, less invasive form of regulation, things like health inspections, would actually do what in any kind of licensing, the only real justification for it most of the time, which is actually protecting people's health and keeping them from getting ripped off.
So I'm not an advocate for more inspections of the restaurants and salons and things like that. I'm pro more inspections and licensing of our politicians, right? Let's turn this around. Instead of, you know, watching us, why don't these politicians have to apply for a license, right? To substantiate that, they know the history of this country. They know what the Constitution is about. They know what the Bill of Rights is about, right? To be able to monitor them. And with that license comes some recertification, some expiration period to say, you can be a politician, you've been certified with this license for 4 years, and then it expires. Why is that only thrust upon me? Why not the politicians also be subject to that? That's my perspective.
On that note, there's actually something that I'm not sure if a lot of people here are familiar with, but it's the principle of decertification for police officers, that when you have, you know, a bad actor moving from one state to another or something like that, that a lot of times their credentials aren't really checked that easily, but if you have a national certification and decertification database, that's something kind of up that alley that I really like.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure.
Sorry, didn't mean to get all passionate about that.
How
but,
dare you.
Thank you.
You're saying that to a libertarian crowd? So I believe competition is good in everything, even the inspection. I'm going to loosely say inspection, meaning private inspection as well as public inspection. I would suggest that it's easier to have corruption in the government-run licensing and inspection and barriers because there's nobody watching them. And I talked with somebody who lived in Chicago, was one of these guys on, you know, he went out and inspected the construction going on, and he's like, here's your hard hat, here's your little sheet, your little checklist, and just go off and put yes to all of these. He didn't say go out and actually look. He said, just be sure you just check yes on all these. Kind of like, don't worry, wink, wink, we've been paid. You can have a health inspector who comes in and gets paid. And what happens? What's the downside? Is the government going to go out of business? Are people going to say, well, we don't want to listen to them anymore? No, but if you have private people going out there giving their opinions, such as the Michelin stars, such as Yelp, and yes, there are problems with that too, but look at Michelin, which has been around for decades. If they went out and they said, oh, this is a 5-star restaurant, and it sucked, people would say, you know what, maybe we're not going to pay money to Michelin, maybe we're not going to listen to them anymore, and they'd go out of business. So only the government can get away with going out and saying, yes, this is a great product, when it's not.
That's a really good point there. And it's funny because on IJ's list is like a competitive certification, stuff like that. So there's a lot of things between everything and nothing. You can have some stuff in there. One thing I'd also be curious about is there's so many kinds of occupational licensing reforms. Politicians really love basically where you can take your license and move it to another state, understandably, because mobility is a really big issue. And it's a big reason people have economic mobility. If you can move somewhere, you can move there for a better job, stuff like that. There's also just getting rid of some stuff. it depends on the state, but I mean, Louisiana hasn't been able to get rid of its florist license. We have tried for a very long time. It hasn't worked. Some hair braiding licenses have gone away. There's also justice reforms, making sure that if you're prohibited from doing a job, that there's a really good means ends fit, that it's not just like you can't work at anything ever again because you have an unrelated conviction. So there's all those and more kinds of reforms. Utah's actually working to match immigrant credentials to US credentials, which is something that we really need to do. But there's a ton of stuff to do. What do you each think that elected officials should focus on? Do you think there's a better reform? Do you think it has to be all or nothing? Or do you think there's something where it's like, if we can't get, full reform, these are some good solutions in there?
Well, I think elected officials would be able to convince, constituents that occupational licenses aren't necessary if they can show that, the reason that they're being marketed, which, as I said, is usually safety, it doesn't actually do what it's supposedly meant to do. If you can say, okay, requiring hair braiders to get, a license, requiring, I'm thinking about the cosmetology related ones, requiring someone to go to cosmetology school, it doesn't actually keep people safer, it doesn't actually keep them from being ripped off, and we can prove it, right? There aren't fewer, I don't know if this is true necessarily, but there aren't fewer traffic deaths, say, by requiring all of these extra hours to be a trucker or something like that. If they can prove that, I think it would be easier to convince people to support measures that involve just getting rid of unnecessary licenses. I think fundamentally that's the most important reform, is to open up the market for more competition, really start ignoring these special interests from people who already have the licenses, who want to artificially restrict the supply of labor, and really just open up the market for real competition and for new, better ideas to come about.
That's the second time this concept of competition has come up, and I think it's a very valuable point. And it's not something that we should invite the government into this sort of this conversation. We ourselves that operate within industry, we should get with our peers. We should understand, should there be some sort of regulation? Should we self-regulate more? I operate within the real estate industry, and many, many times we have these types of these conversations to talk about, like, it's not all about the money. I know a lot of people think, hey, these industries are, these companies are about the money and profit and maximize. Yes, that's important to us, but there's also a socio-economic, hodgepodge of things we talk about, right? One of the things we talk about within real estate is how to help the less fortunate out there obtain affordable housing, right? And whether we dedicate a certain percentage of our housing towards, disadvantaged socioeconomic classes or whatnot, or individuals. So we self-regulate. Right? That makes us better. That makes us stronger. That's our give back to our community. We don't need the government coming in and telling us 20% of your properties should be rented to the less fortunate or those in poverty. We don't need them to do that. We do that. We self-regulate ourselves, and there needs to be more of a cry for companies and industries to do that self-regulation. Let's not rely on the politicians to mandate that. We need to encourage that amongst ourselves rather than having the politicians dictate, because they know nothing about our industry. They know nothing about, I've seen people, present to Congress about crypto and Bitcoin. I'm looking at the audience, I'm looking at this, Congress, and I'm like, these folks are, not for nothing, they're like 60, 70, 80 years old. Their experience, and not to say because you're of a certain age, you don't know about crypto, but their vernacular, their ability to regulate that industry is very far impaired from the industry itself regulating itself. So I think we just need to have more of a cry for industry to do a better job with its own regulation.
So being a libertarian, of course, my first response, the response through every bone in my body, is get rid of all government licensing. However, I realize that not only is that practically very difficult to do, but a lot of people, they would be uncomfortable with it. It might be hard to convince people that, no, we don't need to license your dentist, even though research shows it does no good. So for incremental steps, and again, it really hurts me to try to make government work better because government doesn't work, but okay, incremental steps, since you're asking me. I think one good thing to do would be to have licensing in one state be good for licensing in another state. So is anybody here from Hawaii? Oh, okay. Do you have and you know, it's hard to, oh, hey. Yes, I talked to you Friday. Or yesterday. So do you really have a cat problem? I read an article about a stray cat problem in Hawaii. Stray cats? Nope, okay. Well, then I guess my point won't work. But I read that there are Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yes, wild cats. I read from, it seemed like a reputable source that, but you know, I like to independently verify, but I read from a reputable source that a lot of the wild cats, as you call them, are eating some of the endangered species. And so they need to control the cats. And at the very least, that, you know, of course, nobody likes the idea of euthanasia, but at least spay and neuter them. But the problem is you can't bring in vets from other states who would gladly come and help the problem. It's like, you know, sure, I'll spend a week in Hawaii and go ahead and spay and neuter some of your cats. Instead, they're required, you know, to work under a Hawaiian vet and then work there for so many months and get licensed. It's like, seriously, you're not going to trust a vet from South Carolina to be able to spay and neuter a cat in another state? So at the very least, try to set up something to where, yes, it could be transferable. Now, again, I hate to take away states' rights, I do, but I would ask the lawmakers to look at this common sense and say, hey, we've got strict requirements, again, just like going to dental school and medical school, very strict requirements for going to vet school. In fact, vet school is about as hard to get into as medical school, so it's very stringent just to get not licensed, but just to graduate. So I would suggest looking at that. And one quick note too, this is just another example of unintended consequences from the government. That the government, they try to fix a problem, and then there's 6 other problems that arise because of that. And again, we've got the people on the left who are worried about the environment. Okay, well, how about easing up on your licensing laws so maybe we can help with a problem in Hawaii of some of the almost extinct species.
And that's a great example within the vet industry. Let that vet industry regulate themselves if they feel they need to be, right? To be able to offer products and services to another state where they all have the same values and belief system, right?
Well,
they all care about animals. They don't want to, you know, just euthanize for the sake of euthanize, right? They all have that same belief system. Much like us in the real estate industry, we have a certain belief system. We're here to provide a product and a service to the population. We want to help people of all levels.
I would add to that multiple within the industry. Let's have competing groups within the industry.
A competition is, yes, we need that.
You know, the cat issue is actually really interesting and representative of a lot of what we saw during COVID, where you needed really specialized professionals just to be able to move and go and fix stuff quickly, like whether it's hurricanes and disasters like that, or it was COVID and doctors and nurses. It's not unusual that there's just a strange emergency or just some kind of emergency where you really need a certain kind of professional, and they couldn't work across state lines. And it's funny, the cat and vet issue, it's a unique one, but that's exactly that kind of thing that I've talked about before with emergencies. And COVID was a really big era for that. Governor Ducey was the first to implement universal licensing recognition, and then a bunch of states, now we're up to more than 20, have followed. The laws aren't perfect, they're getting there, they're getting better over time, and more states are doing it. But I think COVID was a really unique era for it. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'd just be curious if you all saw anything during COVID and licensing that kind of taught lessons that we should consider moving forward. Stuff like, oh man, sometimes you need professionals in a new state, and they just have to be able to go and like work there.
So my answer isn't so much during COVID, it's in sort of the aftermath of COVID that we're still dealing with education, right? So many public school systems are having really bad teacher shortages. And one of the main reasons why is sort of the after effects of COVID, both student behavioral problems, student learning, school shutdowns, and there are just not very many people, there are not enough teachers available. And so a lot of states, some states have loosened teacher licensing requirements and allowed people to get sort of a provisional license, or I think some states have let military members teach. And to the best of my knowledge, those teachers have done a pretty good job, right? Kids are not any more than they already are because of COVID or the aftermath of COVID. They're learning about as much as they would otherwise. And as it turns out, you probably don't need so many intensive years of education to be an educator. You don't need this really intensive licensing scheme to be a perfectly adequate public school teacher. And so, what I'm hopeful of is that more states are going to say, okay, if we want to solve our public school teacher shortage, we should just let more people who want to teach.
One of the things alongside that is the realization that we should rely more on ourselves and our communities, right? Homeschooling is a great example, because there's been, I've discovered so many families that have moved to homeschooling as a result of the pandemic, and the realization, and this is the beautiful thing, the realization that they can do it just as good, if not better than the institution, which is refreshing. To be able to have that self-realization that I can do this. I've had conversations with other folks who started growing their own vegetables during the pandemic. And the freedom that comes with that, the self-realization that I can do this, I don't need to rely on the grocery store, I don't need to rely on others for this, was liberating for them. And the same thing with during the pandemic. I know both within my family and other families where they weren't able to go to the doctor. So they had to look up their own symptoms, talk to their community and say, how should I address this issue? What should I take for, whether it's homeopathic therapy or some other type of prescription drug? How should I treat this? And it was liberating for the individuals in the communities to realize, wait a minute, I can do this on my own. And so that I think was a beautiful thing that came out of COVID.
Well, with 21 seconds left, let me just add, and looking at it from the other side, emergency, the individual emergency. Maybe your spouse died. Maybe something happened that now you've got a catastrophe where you need to earn some money quick. And the government is keeping you from going out and earning money right away, that the individual may need it. And time.
Thank you all so much for coming and listening to us nerd about regulatory reform.
Thank you.
All right. I hope everybody has enjoyed LibertyCon so far. I'm thrilled to introduce our final speaker of the conference. Justin Amash served in the U.S. House of Representatives from January 2011 to January 2021. After joining the Libertarian Party in early 2020, he became the highest-ranking Libertarian Party office holder in the country. As an elected official, Representative Amash was a leading advocate of government restraint and a champion of civil liberties. During his time in office, Representative Amash came to be particularly concerned by the harms of power centralization in Congress and increasing partisanship. And since leaving office, he's been exploring ways to combat these trends. His current focus is on growing and strengthening the Libertarian Party and expanding liberty through activism. You can hear him regularly on the Justin Amash podcast, where he hosts long-form conversations with people from all walks of life. But today, you will hear Justin Amash as he wraps up LibertyCon with his thoughts on why Congress is broken, moderated by editor-at-large at Reason Magazine, Nick Gillespie.
All right, thank you everybody for coming out, and even coming out for Justin Amash. But let's give it up to him one more time, please. So the topic of this talk, and we're going to veer away from that, but let's start with, why is Congress broken? And how do we fix that? And let's give you a couple minutes on that.
All right, well, we could take up the whole 30 minutes talking about that if we wanted to. We don't know exactly how Congress got to where it is, but today it is highly centralized, where a few people at the top control everything. And that has a lot of negative consequences for our country. Among them is that the president has an unbelievable amount of power, because the president now only has to negotiate with really a few people. You have to negotiate with the Speaker of the House, you have to negotiate with the Senate Majority Leader, and maybe some of the minority leaders. But it's really a small subset of people that you have to negotiate with. And when that happens, it gives the president so much leverage. So when we talk about things like going to war without authorization, well, as long as the Speaker of the House isn't going to hold the president accountable and the Senate Majority Leader is not going to, the president's just going to do what he wants to do. And when it comes to spending, as long as the president only has to negotiate with a couple people, the president's going to do whatever the president wants to do. So it's super easy in the system for the president to essentially bully Congress and dictate the outcomes. But there's a deeper problem with all of this, which is representative government is supposed to be a discovery process. You elect people to represent you, you send them to Washington, and then the outcomes are supposed to be discovered by these representatives through discussions and debates and the introduction of legislation and amendments. And you're supposed to have lots of votes where you freely, where the votes freely reflect your will, representing the people back home. But instead, in Congress today, a few leaders are deciding what the final product is, and then they're even not bringing it to the floor until they know they have the votes. So there's no actual discovery process. And Nancy Pelosi used to brag about this, like she wouldn't bring a bill to the floor unless she knew it was going to pass.
Right.
Which is the opposite of how Congress should work.
So what are some of the ways to kind of decentralize power within Congress? When you were in Congress, you founded the Freedom Caucus, which was supposed to be kind of a redoubt of people who believed in limited government and libertarian and conservative principles, and actually even some liberal principles, but decentralizing authority. You got kicked out of the Freedom Caucus, right?
Well, I resigned from it.
Well, you were asked to leave, right? It was like the police sirens were coming, and it's like, hey, you know what, I'm going to go, right? But even places like that were explicitly designed to act as a countervailing force to this unified Congress. So how can that happen? What can you do, or what can somebody do to make that happen?
Well, it does take people with strong will. I think that when we go to vote for our elected officials, when you go to vote for a representative, when you go to vote for a senator, you have to know that that person is willing to stand up to the leadership team. And if that person's not willing to break from the leadership team on a consistent basis, and this doesn't mean they have to be mean or anything like that. It just means they have to be...
That's an option, right?
That's an option.
Yeah.
but they just have to be independent enough where you know they're willing to break from their leadership team. And if they're not willing to do that, it doesn't matter how much they agree with you on the issues, don't vote for them, because that person's gonna sell out. There's no chance they're gonna stand up for you when it counts. So I think you need to have people who have a strong will, who are gonna go there and actually represent you and are willing to stand up to the leaders.
If you are interested in Congressman Amash's commentary on contemporary issues, go to his Substack. It's Justin Amash, and the tagline is, "A former congressman spills on Congress and makes the practical case for the principles of liberty." So it's on Substack. It's a great read, and particularly on issues you mentioned, kind of war and things like that, and the War Powers Resolution. It's great stuff. But can you tell us quickly, how did you discover libertarian ideas? And then, you got elected in 2010, which was a wave election. It was the part of the Tea Party reaction to 8 years of Bush and more problems during the financial crisis and the reaction of government to that. Where did you first encounter the ideas of liberty, and how did that motivate you to get into Congress?
Well, the ideas of liberty are something that have been with me since I was a child. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where they came from. I think they came from my parents' immigrant experience, coming to the United States. My dad came here as a refugee, and
a refugee from?
From Palestine.
Yeah.
So he was born in Palestine in 1940, and when the state of Israel was created in 48, he became a refugee. So my mom is a Syrian immigrant. So when my parents came here, they weren't wealthy. My dad was a very poor refugee. I mean, he was so poor that the Palestinians made fun of him. So that's really poor. And when he came here, he didn't have much, but he felt he had opportunity. He felt he had a chance to start a new life, a chance to make it, even though he came from a different background from a lot of people, even though his English wasn't great compared to a lot of people. So he came here and he worked hard and he built a business. And when we were young, he used to tell us that America is the greatest place on earth, where someone can come here as a refugee like he did and start a new life and have the chance to be successful. And it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what obstacles you face. You have a chance here. And you don't have that chance in so many places around the world. So for me, I think that's where that spirit of liberty came from. It was from my dad's experience, especially my mom as well, coming here as a young immigrant. And so I was always a little bit, I guess, anti-authoritarian as a child. I rebelled against teachers at times. I didn't like arbitrary authority, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
When someone just would make up a rule, like, this is the rule, I just say so. Well, tell me why. Like, what's the,
Have you rethought that as a parent?
No, I mean, I let my kids think very freely. Okay. And
as long as they follow the rules.
I don't mind when they are a little bit rebellious. Yeah. I think it doesn't hurt for kids to have some independence. I encourage them to challenge their teachers even when they think the teacher's wrong about something. I think that it's a good thing for people to go out there and not just accept everything as it is. Yeah. So that's that kind of independence.
You famously, as a congressman, explained all of your votes on Facebook, which is a rare concession by authority to say, okay, this is why I did what I did.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of the people in leadership and in Congress didn't like that I was doing that because I was giving people at home the power to challenge them.
Yeah.
So instead of just being told, like, this is the way it is, now I was revealing what was going on.
You grew up in Michigan. You went to University of Michigan as an undergrad and for law school. Was it there that you started coming across names like Hayek and Mises and, Friedman, Rand, Rothbard, or whoever?
Not really, no. Yeah. My background's in economics. My degree's in economics. And thank you.
People love
There's
economics
at least one
out
person
there.
with an economics
Hey, has anybody
degree
here ever been part of economics? Yeah.
Anyone from economics here?
Yeah.
All right.
We'll speak slower.
And I did well in economics at Michigan, but we sure didn't study Austrian economics.
Right.
We didn't study Hayek.
Yeah.
I think he might have been mentioned in one class. Very briefly, he was mentioned. There was one day where he was mentioned. But I'd say that what happened is, as I went through my economics degree, and then I got a law degree at Michigan as well, I started to realize that I had a lot of differences from other people who were otherwise aligned with me. I was a Republican. I aligned with them on a lot of things, but there were a number of issues where we didn't align. Some of the foreign policy issues, but certainly a lot of civil liberties issues. And I started to wonder, what am I?
Yeah.
What's going on here? I just thought of myself as a Republican, and I would read the platform and, hear what they're saying. They believe in limited government and economic freedom and individual liberty. But when push came to shove on a lot of issues, they didn't believe those things. They'd say they believe those things, but they didn't. So, and I've told this story before, I just typed some of my views into a Google search. And up popped Hayek's Wikipedia page. So, and literally it was the top thing on Google. So I clicked on that, started reading about him, and I was already in my mid-20s at this time. I was, and I was like, yes, this is what I believe.
And do you think that full view of individual liberty, not just in the economic sphere, but in everything else, that's informed by your parents' experience and also they're running a business. But it is interesting because you would have been coming of age during a time when the Republicans were ascendant, but they were kind of the war party, and we were told after 9/11 that you should not speak freely. That was kind of a problem, right?
Yeah, sure. And throughout my life, I've believed freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, these are critical values. Maybe they're the essence of everything that makes this country work. The idea that we come from a lot of places. There's an incredible amount of diversity in the United States. I think diversity is always treated, or often treated, like a bad word these days. But it's a blessing to our country that we have people who come from so many backgrounds. And actually, the principle of liberty is about utilizing that diversity. It's in centrally planned systems where diversity is not utilized, where someone at the top dictates to everyone else and doesn't take advantage of any of the diversity. They say, no, a few of us at the top, we know everything. It doesn't matter, all of your backgrounds, all of your skills, all of your talents, that doesn't matter. What matters is we've got a few people in a room somewhere and they're going to decide everything. And they know best because they're experts.
So you came into office in 2011, and it seemed like there was a real libertarian insurgency within the Republican Party, but more nationally in discourse. People were tired of continued centralization, government secrecy, famously, a lot of Bush's activities, and particularly war spending early on, was done in supplemental and emergency appropriations, not really open to full discussion and whatnot. All of this stuff coming out of the Patriot Act, somebody like, I was going to say Darth Vader, I meant Dick Cheney, kind of saying we're in control. But then Obama also promised the most transparent administration ever and plainly did not deliver on that. But that energy pushing back on centralization and government power and government secrecy seems to, that helped bring you and other people like you to Congress, seems to have dissipated. Do you agree with that? And if so, what took that away?
Yeah, I agree with that. When I was running for office, both for State House in 2009, when I was running for for that office. And when I got to Congress in 2011, there was a lot of energy behind sort of a limited government, libertarian-ish republicanism. And I felt like libertarianism was really rising. There was a chance for libertarian ideals to get a lot of traction. And a lot of people who used to be, I guess, more like Bush conservatives were coming around to the libertarian way. So I felt really good about where things were heading. And for the first, I'd say 3 or 4 years that I was in Congress, I felt like we continued to move in the right direction. I mean, the creation of the Freedom Caucus was kind of a dream of like bringing people together to challenge the leadership. They weren't all libertarians or anything like that. I mean, there were a few who were libertarian leaning, but the idea that a group of Republican members, it wasn't determined that it was going to be only Republicans, but it ended up being Republicans, that Republican members got together and said, hey, we're going to challenge the status quo, we're going to challenge the establishment. That was a kind of a dream that it had come together. And then when Donald Trump came on the scene, I think a lot of that just fell apart because he's such a strong personality and character and had so much of a hold over a lot of the public, especially on the Republican side, that it was very hard for my colleagues to be willing to challenge him.
What do you think the essence, there's been a lot of discussion this weekend about the threat of things like national conservatism or Trumpist populism on the right, woke progressivism on the left. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. But what's the essential appeal of Trump? Is it his personality? Is it that he said he could win and he ended up doing that at least once? Is it a cult of personality? Is it the idea he's in charge? What's the core of his appeal, do you think?
Well, I think he's definitely a unique character. He has a certain charisma that is probably unmatched in politics. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen someone who campaigns as effectively as he does. It doesn't mean you have to agree with, all of the ethics of what he does or any of that, or the substance. But I think that...
To keep it in Michigan, he's a rock star. He's Iggy Pop.
Yeah.
You may not like what he's doing on the stage, but you can't take your eyes off it.
That's right. He holds court. Like when he's out there, people pay attention. And he really understands the essence of campaigning, how to win a campaign. He understands how to effectively go after opponents. Now, again, I'm not saying that all of these things are necessarily ethical or that other people should do the same things, but he really understands how to lead a populist movement.
Yeah. And how important do you think in his appeal is a politics of resentment that, somehow he is going to get back what was taken from you unfairly?
Well, I mean, the whole Make America Great Again. Yeah. There's a whole idea there of someone is destroying your life and I'm going to get it back for you. And that's a very powerful thing to a lot of people. For a lot of people out there, it is more important to get back at others than necessarily to have some kind of vision of how this is all going to work going forward. It's not appealing to me because I understand we live in one country. We have people of all sorts of backgrounds. And if you're going to persuade people, you have to be able to live with them and work with them regardless of your differences. It doesn't mean that you can't be upset, be angry about what some other people are doing or saying, but there has to be an effort to live together here as one country. We have too much in common in this country.
Michigan was a massive swing state when he won election. You voted to impeach Donald Trump. What went into that calculation, and then what was the reaction like to that? Because that's a profiling courage.
Well, I don't think that's I don't think that's my most courageous vote, not even by a long shot.
What
Well,
Naming the
I don't-
post office after your father, or
I didn't,
Yeah,
didn't name
yeah.
any post offices after my father, to be clear. So I think that the courageous votes are the ones where everyone is against you. And I don't mean just like, one party. It's one thing to vote for impeachment and like half the country loves what you did and half the country doesn't like what you did. That's, in my mind, not that challenging or difficult. It's when you take a vote and you know that 99% of the public is going to misconstrue this, misunderstand it, be against it. The vote is going to be something like, 433 to 1 in the House or something like that. Those are the tough votes. And there are plenty of those votes out there where you're taking a principled stand and you're doing it to protect people's rights. But it's not the typical narrative.
Is there an example that in your legislative record that you would put forth for that?
Well, I mean, one of the ones I've talked about before is they tried to pass some anti-lynching legislation at the federal level, and everyone's against lynching, obviously. But the legislation itself was bad and would actually harm a lot of people, including harming a lot of Black Americans. So like there was this idea that this legislation was good was just, parroted by a lot of people in the media. They didn't read the legislation. And in fact, I complained about it, and it mysteriously did not pass both houses that Congress after I pointed out all the problems with it. It did pass the House of Representatives, did not pass both houses and get signed by the president. And mysteriously, the next Congress, they reintroduced it and rewrote it in a way that took into consideration all of my complaints. And they tried to pass it off like they were just reintroducing the same legislation. And I pointed out, hey, they actually saw that there was a problem here and then tried to pretend like, oh, we're just passing it again. Those kind of votes are tough because when you take the vote, everyone thinks you're wrong.
Right.
Everyone. And you have to go home and you have to explain it. And those are the ones that are tricky. Back to the impeachment point. Look, I'd impeach every president. Let's be clear. Now, I'm not the kind of person who's going to introduce impeachment legislation, over every thing that a president does wrong. When you introduce legislation to impeach a president, you have to have some backing for it. It can't just be, one person saying, let's impeach. For example, I would definitely impeach President Biden over these unconstitutional wars, 100%. But the idea of introducing impeachment legislation suggests there's other people who will join you. Otherwise, it's just an exercise in futility. Right. You introduce it, it doesn't go anywhere, it just sits there. If we're going to impeach people, there has to be some public backing, which is why I try to make the case all the time for these impeachable offenses, why some legislation should be brought forth. Yeah. But you've got to get the public behind you on that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that every president should be impeached, every recent president at least.
If Trump populism, national conservatism and a politics of resentment is sucking up a lot of energy on the right, how do you feel about, how do we deal with the rise of identity politics and a kind of woke progressivism on the left? Where is that coming from, and what is the best way to combat that?
I think a lot of it is just repackaged socialist ideas, collectivist ideas. The idea of equity, for example, is really like a perversion of the idea of equality. In most respects, when people say equity, they mean the opposite of equality. It means you're going to have the government or some central authority decide what the outcome should be, how much each person should have, rather than some system of equality before the law, where the government is not some kind of arbiter of who deserves what. And when you think about it,
there is no way for the government to do this. There's no way for the government to properly assess all of our lives. This is, in many ways, the point of diversity is like we're all so different, and there's no way that a central authority can decide how to manage all that. So for many of the people on the woke left who say they care about diversity, they don't care about diversity if they're talking about equity. These things are in conflict with each other. The idea that you're going to decide that someone is more deserving than another based on some superficial characteristics. As an example, I've talked about this, and I've talked about this earlier in this conversation. My dad came here with nothing as a poor refugee. Yet, in a lot of cases, he might be classified as just a white American, even though he came here as an extremely poor Palestinian refugee. The New York Times, for example, classifies me as white. They might classify someone else who's Middle Eastern as a person of color.
They actually did, right, with Rashida Tlaib.
So I think a lot of this is just someone is making decisions at the top saying, well, we think this person is more like this or that, and we're going to decide they're more deserving. But they don't know our backgrounds. They don't know anything about us. They don't know who deserves this or who deserves that, and no central authority could figure that out. So the best thing we can do is have a system of equality before the law, where the law treats everyone the same. It doesn't give an advantage to any person over another person. And it may not be fair in some sense to some people. Some people may say, well, that's not fair. Some people, instead of having a dad who's a Palestinian refugee, their dad was some, Silicon Valley billionaire. Some person might have a dad who was a professor. Another person might have a dad who worked at a fast food restaurant. You don't know what the differences are. The government can't figure all of this out and say who is more deserving than someone else. So I really think that the woke left, when they push this idea of equity, they're really pushing against diversity. They're saying we're going to decide, a few people at the top are going to decide who's valuable and who's not valuable. And they're not going to actually take into consideration any of our differences because no central authority could take it into consideration.
You are a libertarian, not an anarchist. You believe there is a role for government, but it should be obviously much more limited. You're also—
Although that's a complicated topic, but I could write a whole book about that.
We would love to read that book. You are also an Orthodox Christian. Could you talk a little bit about how in a world of limited government, a libertarian world, the government wouldn't be doing everything for everybody, but organizations and institutions like the church or other types of intervening, countervailing, mediating institutions would help to fill the gaps that are left by government?
Yeah, for sure. That's the place for these organizations, is to help in society, not to have government deciding it. And again, when you have some central authority deciding it, you are really limiting the opportunities for the public. You're limiting the opportunities for assisting people. You're deciding that a few people are going to make all the decisions rather than having a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals making decisions. When you centralize it all, there are a lot of people who are going to be missed, a lot of people who are going to be ignored. When you let the marketplace work this out, when you let private organizations work this out, there's a lot more opportunity for people who need help to get help. And I think that's really important.
We're running out of time, but I want to ask, to go back to this question of there was a libertarian wave. I like to call it a libertarian moment, which I think we're still living in, but we don't understand. Rhetoric aside.
There's been a pause.
Yeah, okay. What are the best ways to kind of get libertarian ideas and sensibilities in front of young people to really energize the coming, you're a millennial, and Gen Z, like the world is getting young again. And how do we make sure that these people are hearing and understanding and maybe being persuaded by libertarian ideas?
Well, for one thing, we have to meet them where they are. I spend a lot of time, for example, asking my kids which social media kids use these days.
Exclusively Pornhub, in my experience.
They're in a lot of places that the adults aren't. So we might be on Facebook. I mean, my generation, your generation. Other people are on X or Twitter, and there are other people on TikTok. And so, like, you have to meet them where they are. And if they're not on X, and it's still weird calling it X. If they're not on X, and you are, well, they're not hearing your message. So that's an issue. And that's something we all have to work on. You know, I'm probably reaching primarily Gen X and millennial people on X, and I'm probably not reaching Gen Z people as well. So, I think we need to work on getting them in those places.
Okay.
And also, I think people who have libertarian instincts, people who want to present libertarianism and have an opportunity, go speak to students at schools. I used to do this as a member of Congress. I used that opportunity as much as I could. When schools would invite me, I'd say yes, I'd be happy to come to the school to speak to the students and take all their questions and be open about being a libertarian. Tell them frankly that your philosophy is libertarianism and talk to them about it. I think it's great. A lot of teachers end up surprised. They walk away saying, I've had many teachers walk up to me and say, like, whisper to me, I think I'm a libertarian too, after having the conversation, because they have stereotypes about what it might mean to be a libertarian. And you have the opportunity to change their mind.
Final question. I have seen a lot of chatter. I have actually helped publish a lot of chatter that you may be running for the U.S. Senate from the mediocre state of Michigan. Do you have an announcement?
Go blue.
Yeah. Do you have an announcement that you would like to make?
So, as a part of the national championship winning state of Michigan this year, I am exploring a run for Senate. The FEC requires me to state that I am not a candidate for Senate, but I am exploring a run for Senate. And if you're interested in checking it out, go to exploratory.justinamash.com. I'm giving it serious thought. I think that there is an opportunity for libertarians this year, and there's an opportunity to win a Republican Senate seat this year. So I'm looking at the Republican primary, and I think this is probably the best shot libertarians have had in a long time in the state of Michigan.
All right. Thank you very much, Justin Amash.
Thanks. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
All right, that about does it for us. Let's have another round of applause for all our fantastic speakers this weekend. We hope you had a wonderful time at LibertyCon. There will be an announcement soon about next year's conference, but let's, for now, just continue to have these conversations about how to spread the message of liberty, make the libertarian moment bigger, better than ever before, and everyone get home safe. Thank you all so much.